The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to start with the general context within which this bill comes before this House, and that is we in Canada, like other states, have spent the better part of the last 150 years pursuing a criminalized and prohibitionist model towards the regulation of cannabis. Colloquially, it's known as the war on drugs, where successive governments have regarded cannabis as a substance that is dangerous and that citizens don't have a right to access, possess, or use in any way. And the official policy of successive Liberal and Conservative governments for the last 150 years has been to make that a crime to possess or use cannabis. Well, we all know through long experience and reams of data that this approach to regulating cannabis is a completely failed policy. And it failed for a variety of reasons. First, some people believe that what folks choose to ingest is fundamentally an individual decision, as long as it doesn't affect others, that the state really doesn't have a right to tell a citizen what or what not they should put in their body. Others believe that if it is a crime, it's a truly victimless crime. If someone chooses to smoke a joint on a Friday night, people have great difficulty regarding that in any way, shape, or form as a crime. Canadians can legally ingest alcohol or tobacco, both substances that overwhelmingly, demonstrably, have more serious adverse health effects when compared to cannabis. And most people have long believed it is an unacceptable contradiction to allow the state to criminalize cannabis while leaving these other substances, carcinogens, and substances that, when used exactly as directed, can cause death. I want to pause for a moment and tell you one of the most stark moments of testimony when we were studying this bill in committee was when a person said you can walk into a liquor store and walk out with a 26-ounce bottle of liquor, and there's enough liquor in that bottle to kill you. Kill a child. And we all know, I don't think I have to tell any member in this House, remind them what the effects of tobacco are, which is a carcinogen that kills Canadians unacceptably every year. The other thing, of course, I think that lies behind this context is that almost every harm, I would argue every harm, associated with illegal drug use stems from the criminalization of the drug use, not the drug itself. And that's because people that choose to smoke a joint on a Friday night or have a drink of scotch on a Saturday night or share a bottle of wine do not feel that that's inherently a criminal act. But there are problems associated with those substances because they are serious substances that have mind-altering properties. So obviously, regulation of these substances is in order. But when there is a problem where people have problem usage with cannabis and other substances like that, we and the New Democrats don't see that as a criminal justice issue. We see that as a social justice issue. So when we see a person with a drug problem, we see a health issue or an addictions issue or a poverty issue. We do not see a criminal issue. And if experience has taught us anything after spending billions and billions and billions of dollars in Canada, the United States, and other jurisdictions to try to stamp out drug use, we know that it doesn't work. In fact, the statistics before our committee were very clear that Canadian youth are among the first or second highest users of cannabis in the world. And that's in a context where we have, it's totally criminal, and actually we have life sentences for trafficking in the criminal code. So in that context, it hasn't done a darn thing. Now, last election, and most importantly, as we live in a democracy, the vast majority of Canadians, across party lines, I would argue, overwhelmingly see the criminalization of cannabis as an unjustified approach. They want it changed. Last election, some 65% voted for parties who explicitly campaigned on decriminalizing or legalizing cannabis. Even some Conservatives believe, on individual liberty grounds and other such philosophies, that cannabis ought to be legalized. So after the 2015 election, then, Canadians were entitled to assume that their expectation that marijuana would be legalized would finally be enacted. They are disappointed, Mr. Speaker, because this Act does not legalize cannabis. and I'll speak to that in a moment. When we examine C-45, I would describe it truly as a horse of two colors. On the one hand, it is a definite improvement over the status quo. Finally, Canadians will no longer be criminals simply for possessing and growing small amounts of cannabis. Second, it creates a production and retail market for legal cannabis, albeit highly regulated and controlled by the state. On the other hand, it is a great disappointment for all those who believed that the Liberal government was going to legalize cannabis, because this bill does not. It creates more cannabis offences than we have at present. It maintains the criminalized, prohibitionist model of cannabis policy. It fails to capture the huge economic potential of cannabis as a sustainable, high-value product worth billions of dollars to our economy. And it is informed by and perpetuates many of the worst unfounded myths of cannabis. Now, this is truly unfortunate, because the Liberal government had an opportunity and the mandate from the Canadian people to bring in comprehensive legislation based on evidence and science to fix this long-standing social and legal injustice, but they failed to do so. So what does C-45 do? It allows personal public possession of cannabis up to 30 grams. It allows every household to grow up to 4 cannabis plants, originally limiting it to 100 centimeters in height. It creates a process for those who want to grow cannabis for commercial, recreational production to obtain licensing from the federal government. And it sets the legal age for possessing cannabis at a minimum age of 18 years. And it delegates to the provinces the ability to design the retail distribution model they want to apply in their particular jurisdiction. What this bill does not do, Mr. Speaker, is it fails to eliminate criminal penalties for a host of offences, with many subjecting Canadians up to a maximum 14 years imprisonment. It continues to make edibles and contradicts illegal, in stark contradiction to the recommendations of the McClellan Report and the purpose of the bill, which is explicitly to bring production of cannabis products outside of the black market into the licit world. It prohibits the importing and exporting of recreational cannabis products, and it perpetuates the discriminatory application of criminalized cannabis laws to the most marginalized Canadians, including poor, racialized, Indigenous, and young people. Finally, it fails to deal with pardons for the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who bear convictions for simple possession offences, which, as the Liberal government acknowledges, has devastating consequences for Canadians, employment-wise, travel-wise, socially, economically. Now, the NDP believes strongly in legalization of cannabis. In fact, no party in this House has the record of consistency on this issue that the NDP has, working since the 1970s to decriminalize cannabis use in Canada. So we set out to work proactively and positively to examine this bill and improve it. We called the most diverse and informed witnesses before the Health Committee to obtain the best evidence we could to inform committee members. And we moved 38 recommendations, 38 amendments at committee to improve this bill. Unfortunately, the Liberals joined with the Conservatives to defeat every single NDP amendment. In fact, it was so bad that the NDP amendment to remove the ridiculous 100-centimetre limit on plant height was voted down by the Liberals, only to have them introduce the identical amendment so that they could take credit for passing it. But that's okay. Progress is progress, Mr. Speaker. They rejected the NDP amendments to actually add pardons to this bill, and it was ruled outside the scope of the bill. Now, Mr. Speaker, can you imagine groundbreaking cannabis legislation in this country to change 100 years of criminal approach to cannabis, and the Liberals forgot to put into the bill any provision that would allow Canadians with simple possession records to actually have at least a streamlined approach to obtain a pardon after this bill becomes law. A Canadian could be charged or convicted on June 30th of 2018 for simple possession of cannabis for doing exactly the same thing that will be legal on July 1, 2018. And this present government is content with that. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to conclude just by saying the NDP wants to work proactively with this government. We support this bill because it absolutely is an improvement over the status quo, but we will continue to work for legislation that actually reflects the science, reflects the evidence, and reflects the huge economic potential of this. I'm going to conclude just by saying the restriction on importing and exporting cannabis is absolutely going to hamstring Canadian business when we could be a global leader with first market access, with high-quality cannabis products, as the rest of the world comes to the same conclusion that Canada has, which is that criminalizing cannabis is a mistake and poor public policy, and they will be moving to legalize cannabis in their jurisdictions as well. So, Mr. Speaker, the NDP will continue to work towards those ends.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Cape